There were 2 chairs at either end of the Duke of Rivenoak's breakfast table, and for 6 years only one of them had ever been warm. It sat to his right, that chair, plain oak, with a cushion gone thin at the centre, and it was where his mother used to sit before she died, and where nobody had thought to sit since, because nobody had ever been told why it mattered. The Duke did not explain. The Duke did not explain a great many things, which was, in the opinion of everyone who had ever worked at Rivenoak, both his greatest talent and his most exhausting habit. Guests sat where they liked. Housemaids delivered trays where trays were customarily delivered, which was to his left, closer to the door, out of 100 years of nobody thinking twice about it. And the Duke of Rivenoak, 31 years old, unmarried, unlaughing, and profoundly, permanently deaf in his left ear since the fever of his 9th year, said "I beg your pardon" so often and so evenly that the household had stopped hearing it as a request and started hearing it as a tick, the way some men clear their throats. He had not laughed, by the countable estimation of the staff who kept such things the way other households kept the silver inventory, in 6 years. Smiled, on rare mechanical occasions, at weddings and at tenants' children, the sort of smile that arrived and departed on schedule like a coach. Laughed, the real thing, the involuntary thing, the thing that catches a man by the ribs before his dignity can stop it, not once. His mother had died in the 6th spring past, and something in him had been filed down to a single flat plane the week after, and he had gone on being correct about it for 6 years running, which was, his aunt liked to say, the single most Rivenoak thing a Rivenoak had ever done. Into this arrangement walked Clemency Vane, 24 years old, newly hired as an upper housemaid, on the recommendation of no one important, carrying 1 trunk, 1 grey cat's worth of composure, and a laugh that had gotten her into trouble in 4 previous situations, because it arrived exactly when it wanted to, and not one moment when it was wanted. She had unafraid eyes, pale hazel, if anyone had thought to look, which eventually somebody did, and the particular quality of a woman who has nursed one difficult old man through one long decline, and come out the other side deciding, quite firmly, that the correct response to a hard world was not to flinch from it, but to find where the joke was hiding in it. Her grandfather, Tobias, had lost his hearing entirely in a mill accident when she was 12, and she had spent 4 years learning, without a single book on the subject, exactly how a proud deaf man moves through a room built by people who have never once considered him. By the time the roses at Rivenoak had bloomed twice more, the Duke would no longer need anyone at his own table to repeat themselves. He would, in fact, come to regard the entire concept of repeating oneself as faintly barbaric, a relic of an uncivilized age. But that understanding was some distance off yet, and nothing about his winter went as planned, and before any of it, before the letters, before his aunt's examination, before the itemised and badly delivered proposal that the servants would discuss for a decade, there was, quite simply, a wobbling chair, and a girl who laughed at falling out of it before anyone could tell her not to. It began, as these things so often do, with a chair leg. Clemency had been at Rivenoak 11 days when she was assigned to lay the breakfast room before the family rose, which meant arriving while the house was still dark and the fires still catching, and which meant, on the 11th morning, discovering that the plain oak chair at the head of the table, the one on the right, the one nobody used, had a leg gone loose at the joint. She tested it the way she tested everything, by sitting in it, and the leg gave with a small ceremonious crack, and Clemency Vane went over sideways with a tray of spoons in one hand, and a laugh already halfway out of her before she'd finished falling. "You'll want a physician," said a voice from the doorway, "or possibly a carpenter. I confess I'm not certain which of you is more urgently in need of repair." She looked up from the floor to find the Duke of Riverneck regarding her, with an expression that was trying very hard to be nothing at all. He had not expected anyone in the breakfast room at that hour. He had, in point of fact, come down early for the specific and private purpose of sitting alone in a quiet house before the day required him to be correct at people, and instead he had found a housemaid laughing on his mother's side of the table with a spoon in her collar. "The chair, Your Grace," said Clemency, gathering the spoons with the unhurried dignity of someone who has decided that dignity is a matter of manner and not of posture, "will require the carpenter. I will require, at most, a moment." You laughed. "I generally do, when a piece of furniture attempts to assassinate me." He did not smile. Something adjacent to a smile occurred somewhere near his mouth, and was corrected within perhaps 2 seconds, filed away, gone. "Most people," he said, "apologize." "Most people," she agreed, rising and setting the tray to rights, "are not currently on the floor of your breakfast room, Your Grace, and can therefore afford the composure." He looked at her for a moment longer than the exchange required. It was the eyes that did it, though he would not have said so, would in fact have denied it under formal questioning. She had looked directly at him, unafraid, uncalculating, the way almost nobody at Rivenoak looked at him any more, because almost everybody at Rivenoak had learned, correctly, that looking at a duke required a certain angled deference, a slight downward register, as though he were a painting best viewed from 3 quarters. Clemency Vane looked at him the way one looks at weather. He found he did not entirely dislike it. "The chair has been loose for some time," he said, which was not true, and which he did not examine at any great length, because examining it would have required admitting that he had come downstairs specifically to sit in it, alone, the way he sometimes did before the house woke, in the particular silence of a room that still smelled, very faintly and very foolishly, of his mother's lavender water 6 years after the fact. "I'll have it seen to today," Clemency said. "See that you do." He turned to go, and then, because a small elderly brown and white spaniel had at that moment ambled into the room, taken one long assessing look at the fallen chair, the spoons, and the laughing housemaid, and settled himself with a thump directly across her feet, as though rendering a verdict, the Duke paused. "Diogenes doesn't do that," he said. "Do what, Your Grace?" "Sit on people. He is extremely selective. He didn't even do it for the bishop." He said this the way a man reports a minor irregularity in the accounts, entirely without warmth, and left the room with the exact bearing of a man who had come down for nothing in particular, and was now going back up for nothing in particular, which fooled precisely no one, least of all himself. He told himself, climbing the stairs, that the visit had been about the quiet. The quiet had, in fact, been perfectly fine before he interrupted it. He did not examine this either. By the 2nd week, the Duke of Riverneck had developed an extraordinary number of small administrative concerns that happened to require his presence in rooms where Clemency Vane was also, coincidentally, working, the East Gate latch, which had functioned without complaint for 11 years, was suddenly a matter of urgent structural review, conducted at length at the precise hour the linens were being aired in the adjoining yard. The library required a full inventory of its account books, a task he assigned to himself personally, though he had a steward for exactly this purpose, on the same 3 afternoons that Clemency had been given leave, to sit there and mend the curtains. He conducted what he called an interview regarding the household's candle expenditure that lasted 40 minutes, and touched on candles for perhaps 4 of them. "He's inventorying the library again," Simmons the butler informed Mrs. Fenwick the housekeeper, with the flat delivery of a man reading a shipping manifest. "That's the 3rd time this month. 4th, if you count the ledger he brought down to the kitchen on Tuesday, which he did not need, and which he returned unopened." Mrs. Fenwick, who had run the household for 19 years, and had therefore watched the Duke grow from a solemn boy into a solemn man without a single interruption in the solemnity, allowed herself one long look at the ceiling. "How many times has he been down to the East Wing this fortnight?" 6, said Simmons, "which is 5 more than the 11 years previous combined, and I include the year the roof required attention." Neither of them said Clemency's name. Neither of them needed to. The ledger was being kept regardless, in the particular unhurried manner of servants who have decided that watching a proud man fall slowly in love is one of the few entertainments a large cold house reliably offers, and who intend to enjoy every recorded minute of it. What none of them witnessed, because it occurred behind the closed door of the estate office on a wet Tuesday, was the moment the Duke discovered that Clemency Vane could read a lease. He had come in, ostensibly to fetch a document, and found her there at his steward's request, settling a dispute between 2 tenant families over a boundary hedge that had apparently occupied 3 generations of ill will, and 1 entirely illegible original survey. She had the survey spread across the desk, and the tenant's furious grandson standing on one side of it, and she was tracing a line with one steady finger and saying, in the tone of a woman reading a recipe rather than resolving a feud, "Your great-grandfather's mark is here, plainly, 3 rods from the elm, which puts the hedge exactly where it currently stands, which means, respectfully, that your family has been aggrieved at your own hedge for 40 years. The grandson opened his mouth. Clemency slid the survey a half-inch closer to him. "You are welcome to disagree with your great-grandfather. I would only note that he is, at present, unavailable for comment." The grandson left considerably calmer than he had arrived, muttering something that was almost a laugh. "You read Chancery hand," the Duke said, once the room was empty, in the tone of a man announcing a discovery of some geological significance. "My grandfather kept mill accounts for 30 years, Your Grace. Someone had to read the old ones to him once his eyes went, and it was rarely convenient to hire a solicitor to translate a wool tally." "Convenient," he repeated, and something in his face did the thing again. The almost, the correction, filed, Simmons, passing the office door with an armload of correspondence, noted the hour, and made a small mark in the private mental ledger he did not admit to keeping. First almost smile of substance, he thought. 11 seconds. A personal record. The east wing of Rivenoak had 11 rooms, and one of them had not been opened in 6 years. It was the music room, at the end of the gallery, where his mother's pianoforte still stood under a sheet the colour of old snow, and where once on winter evenings the whole household had contrived reasons to be within earshot of the corridor, because the old Duchess had played after supper the way other women embroidered, constantly, unremarkably, as background to living. She had also, without ever once making a spectacle of it, always taken the chair to her son's right at any table in the house, and had always positioned herself on his right in any conversation of more than 2 people, and had done this so smoothly and for so many years that nobody, including the Duke himself in his more honest hours, had ever quite registered it as a system. She had simply been there, on the correct side, every time. When she died, the system died with her, because nobody else had ever been let in on it. Clemency learned of the music room the way she learned most things at Rivenoak, sideways, from Mrs. Fenwick, delivered with the particular brisk economy of a woman who has decided grief is a fact of the house like damp, to be managed rather than discussed. "We don't go in there, Mrs.," Fenwick said, passing the door with a stack of linens and not slowing her step. "Hasn't been aired since her ladyship passed. His Grace has never said not to. He's simply never said to. Does he go in? Not once. Not the anniversary, not Christmas, not for the pianoforte tuner, who we still pay quarterly out of habit no one has the nerve to correct." Mrs. Fenwick's mouth did something complicated. "You'll find, Vane, that this house doesn't forbid things. It simply stops doing them, and everyone agrees not to notice." Clemency thought of her own stopped things, her grandfather's chair by the mill account desk, empty 3 years now, which her mother still dusted every Sunday, though nobody had sat in it since the funeral. Grief, in her experience, was rarely a wound you could point to. It was a room, it was a chair, it was the particular silence of an instrument nobody dared to want played. She did not go into the music room. She was not fool enough for that. 11 days in, with the leg of a chair still fresh in the Duke's mind. But she began, without much ceremony, to notice things, the way she had noticed her grandfather leaning his good ear toward a speaker without ever once admitting he needed to. The Duke turned his head a particular half-inch whenever a footman addressed him from his left. He positioned himself, at every gathering, with his back nearly to a wall, so that no one could approach him from a direction he could not track. He asked, "I beg your pardon," with the exact evenness of a man who has practised not sounding embarrassed 4, 5, sometimes 6 times a day, and nobody in the house appeared to find this remarkable at all, which told Clemency more than any of it individually did. She began, without comment, to bring his morning correspondence in on his right. She began, when the household gathered of an evening for the reading of the newspaper, to take the chair at his right hand, quietly, before anyone else could claim it out of habit, and to stay there through the reading without explaining why, the way she did most things, competently, unremarked, as though it was simply the obvious place for a chair to be occupied. Nobody commented for some time. The Duke, for his part, noticed only that conversation at supper had become, without his being able to say precisely how, considerably easier to follow. He attributed this, privately, and with the confidence of a man who has never once questioned his own excellent self-management, to the new cook's improved acoustics in the dining-room, a theory so thin that even Diogenes, curled at Clemency's feet under the table each night now as a matter of settled routine, would have disputed it if dogs were given to argument. They fell, without either of them declaring it, into a Thursday. It began as an accident of scheduling, his estate rounds and her afternoon off coinciding once, then twice, and became, by the 4th week, an arrangement neither of them named. He would find some reason to be walking the lower orchard path at 4. She would find some reason to be crossing it with a basket of something perfectly ordinary. They discussed the weather, the state of the hedges, the temperament of a particular ram that had opinions about gates. Neither of them discussed the fact that they had begun to look for each other before either of them arrived. It simply became true, the way a path becomes a path, not built, only walked often enough that the grass gives up. "You could simply invite me to walk with you," Clemency said on the 5th Thursday, with a directness that had by now stopped surprising him, and started, quietly, to organise itself into something he thought about at inconvenient hours. It would save us both the trouble of these elaborate coincidences. I don't know what you mean. You have inspected that gate 4 times this month, Your Grace. It has not once required it. The gate, he said, with the particular dignity of a man defending a position he privately knows to be indefensible, is a menace. The gate, Clemency agreed, has never harmed a soul in its life, and we both know it. He did not deny it again. He simply fell into step beside her, on her left, which put him on her right, which, though neither of them said so, and neither of them entirely understood yet why it mattered so much that she always arranged it, meant that for the length of the orchard path he did not have to ask her to repeat a single word. Rain caught them at the far end of the orchard in the 5th week, sudden and thorough, the kind that arrives without negotiation, and there was nowhere to go but the old garden folly at the boundary wall. A domed stone shelter built by some optimistic ancestor for the enjoyment of views that had long since grown over, and so the Duke of Rivenoak and his housemaid found themselves sitting on a stone bench 3 feet apart, watching the orchard disappear behind grey curtains of water, with nothing to do, and nowhere to be, for the better part of an hour. "You've never asked," he said, after a silence that had gone on long enough to become its own kind of conversation, "why I always turn my head." Clemency considered several answers, discarded the clever ones, and chose the true one, because she had found, over 4 years of managing her grandfather's pride, that the true one usually cost less in the end. "I assumed you had your reasons, Your Grace, and that they were yours to keep. My mother used to sit on my right." He said it plainly, looking at the rain rather than at her, which she had also learned, without being told, was how he managed anything that cost him something. At every table, in every room, I did not understand for a great many years that she was doing it on purpose. When did you understand? The week after she died. I sat down to breakfast alone, in my usual chair, and someone, a footman, new, well-meaning, addressed me from the left, and I did not hear a word of it, and I realised I had gone 23 years without once having to ask anyone to repeat themselves at that table, and I had never once wondered why. Clemency did not say I know. She did not say I've noticed. She said, after a moment, in a voice that had lost none of its dryness, but had gained something else underneath it, "The fever, when you were 9. He looked at her then, properly, fully, the way he had looked at her that first morning on the floor of the breakfast-room, except that this time there was no correction afterward, no filing away. Nobody at Rivenoak has said that sentence aloud in 6 years. I nursed my grandfather through a mill accident that took his hearing entirely on one side, she said. I know the particular tilt of a head that's learned to compensate before anyone else has noticed there's anything to compensate for. I know the exact evenness of a man saying I beg your pardon, so that it sounds like courtesy and not like cost. She met his eyes, unafraid, the way she met everything. I wasn't going to say it first. It wasn't mine to say. Something in him, some sealed, correctly ordered, filed-away room, opened by perhaps an inch. It was not a declaration. It was not even quite a smile, though the thing that occurred near his mouth this time lasted, by any honest accounting, considerably longer than 11 seconds, and it reached, for the first time in 6 years, as far as his eyes. Rivenoak has had a great deal of small mercy shown it, he said finally, and never once been asked to notice. Then perhaps, said Clemency, it's overdue. The rain went on being thorough. Neither of them moved to shorten the wait. his aunt arrived on a Tuesday, with 4 trunks, a lady's maid, and an agenda she had not troubled to disguise even slightly. Honoria, Lady Ferris, was the old Duchess's sister, sharp-eyed, upright as a fence-post, and possessed of the particular authority that belongs to women who have buried 2 husbands and outlived their own capacity to be impressed by rank. She had written ahead to announce that she intended to look the household over, which everyone below stairs correctly translated, as she intends to find him a wife whether he wants one or not, and she had brought with her the name of a perfectly amiable young woman of excellent fortune whom she had every intention of seating beside her nephew at dinner as often as decency permitted. The Duke received this news with the flat courtesy of a man enduring weather. Clemency received it, privately, with something closer to a held breath, though she would have denied, under any questioning, that it was any business of a housemaid's whom a duke chose to marry. What neither of them knew, what only Simmons and Mrs. Fenwick had pieced together from the correspondence that passed through their hands, was that the Duke had, that same week, quietly instructed his solicitor to renew, at his own expense, and for a term of 30 years rather than the customary 7, the lease on a small cottage 2 miles beyond the home farm, the lease belonging to a Mrs. Vane, widow, whose daughter was currently in service at the great house, and had never once mentioned that her mother's roof had been giving her trouble since the spring, because it was not the sort of thing Clemency mentioned to anyone, least of all to a duke she had specific and sensible reasons not to burden. "She's never to know it came from me," he told the solicitor, with the particular firmness of a man laying down a rule he suspects he will not keep for very long. "As you wish, your grace." He did not examine at any great length why the roof of a housemaid's mother's cottage had become a matter he attended to personally, on a Tuesday, before breakfast, ahead of 3 items of considerably greater estate importance. Some rooms, even in a man as ordered as Gabriel Hartley, simply did not bear close inspection, and he had gotten very good over 6 years at knowing which doors to leave shut. Lady Ferris's examination of Clemency Vane took place on the 3rd afternoon of her visit, in the small drawing-room, over tea that Clemency had been specifically summoned to pour, an assignment so transparently engineered that Mrs. Fenwick had warned her of it an hour in advance with the grim solidarity of a general briefing a soldier before a known ambush. "You've been at Rivenoak how long, girl?" 9 weeks, my lady. "And in that 9 weeks you have contrived to be present at my nephew's breakfast, his library, his orchard walk, and now, I am reliably informed, at his right hand at nearly every meal in this house, without a single person having instructed you to do so." Lady Ferris set down her cup with the precise click of a woman who has spent 40 years making punctuation with china. "I should like to know why." The room went very still. Clemency did not look at the Duke, who had positioned himself, as he always did now, though nobody had remarked on it, near the fireplace on Clemency's side of the room. "Because, my lady," Clemency said, "His Grace hears very little of what is said to him from his left, and rather a great deal from his right, and it seemed to me a small enough thing to arrange a chair correctly, given that no one else appeared to have thought of it in some years." There was a silence of a different quality entirely. "You knew that," Lady Ferris said slowly, "and you told no one." "It was not mine to tell, my lady. It is his Grace's fact, and his Grace is to share, or not, as he chooses. I only moved a chair." Lady Ferris looked at her nephew for a long moment, a long, assessing, entirely unsentimental moment, the kind she had been giving people for 6 decades, and then, to the considerable astonishment of everyone in the room, including herself, her eyes filled, once, briefly, and were briskly mastered before a single tear could commit the indignity of falling. My sister, she said, did precisely that. For 23 years, and never once told a soul either, the stubborn creature, and I used to think it was pride. She looked at Clemency with something that had, in the space of one afternoon, entirely rearranged itself. I begin to think it may have been the finest kind of love there is, the kind that never once asks to be thanked for noticing. "Aunt," the Duke said, low, "oh, hush, Gabriel, I am not finished." Lady Ferris turned back to Clemency and delivered, in the driest possible tone, the line the household would repeat to each other for the better part of a decade. "Miss Vane, I came here to find my nephew a suitable wife." I confess I had not accounted for one already sitting at his right hand, pouring his tea, and refusing, on principle, to take credit for it. You will forgive me if I abandon the search early. It appears to have concluded itself. It was 3 days later that the letter arrived, not from Lady Ferris's amiable young lady, who had in fact never had the faintest interest in the arrangement, and said as much with visible relief, but from a cousin twice removed named Aldous Crane, heir presumptive should the Duke die without issue, who had heard rumour of an upper housemaid installed in unusual favour, and had decided, with the confidence of a man who had never once been required to substantiate an accusation, to write directly to Lady Ferris, alleging that the girl Vane had been dismissed from a previous situation under suspicion of theft, and ought, in the interest of the family's dignity, to be removed before matters progressed further. It was not true. It took Mrs. Fenwick, who had filed Clemency's reference letters on arrival with the thoroughness of a woman who trusted no situation entirely, exactly one afternoon to produce the original letter from Clemency's previous employer, a Mrs. Wexford of Lindale, a woman with excellent handwriting and no patience whatsoever for slander, praising Miss Vane's honesty in terms so specific and so effusive that Mr. Crane's letter did not survive contact with it. The Duke read both letters side by side at his desk, said nothing for a full minute, and then wrote to his solicitor a communication so precisely worded and so thoroughly documented that Mr. Crane, upon receiving it, quietly withdrew both his accusation and within the fortnight his person from the county entirely, and was not missed by anyone, which he would have minded most of all, had he possessed the self-awareness to notice. But accusations, even defeated ones, leave a mark on the accused, and Clemency, mortified past all her usual composure at having become, however briefly, the subject of a formal household inquiry, did what women in her position had always done when their presence became a complication for a man above their station. She gave notice. She did not tell the Duke directly. She told Mrs. Fenwick, on a grey Tuesday morning, in a voice that stayed admirably level until the very last sentence, when it did not. Rivenoak, in the 4 days that followed, became a house of people pretending very hard not to notice a great deal. The Duke ate almost nothing. Simmons observed this and said nothing, because there was, in his professional opinion, nothing yet to be said. He stopped his Thursday orchard rounds, because there was no longer any reason to walk a path that would not, this week, produce a girl with a basket at the far end of it. He sat, each evening, in the chair at the head of the table, and the chair to his right sat empty, and Mrs. Fenwick noted that he had taken, twice now, to glancing at it mid-sentence, as though expecting it to answer for itself. "He has asked me to repeat myself 4 times at dinner this week," Simmons reported to Mrs. Fenwick, with the weary precision of a man keeping an unwelcome ledger. "He has not asked in over 2 months. He'll ride out after her, Mrs., Fenwick said. It was not a question. He has not yet worked out that he intends to. Diogenes, for his part, had taken up a vigil directly outside the estate office door, in the specific manner of a dog who understood, with whatever private canine logic governed his considerable opinions, that something in the house had gone wrong and required correcting by someone with legs longer than his own. The Duke worked out that he intended to ride after her on the morning of the 5th day, at roughly the hour Clemency's coach was due to depart for her mother's cottage, which he discovered because Lady Ferris, who had appointed herself, without asking anyone's permission, the household's chief strategist in the matter, informed him of the coach's schedule over breakfast with the studied casualness of a woman dropping a stone into still water to watch the ripples. He did not finish his tea. He was on horseback within 11 minutes, which Mrs. Fenwick, watching from the window with the satisfaction of a general whose battle plan is finally executing correctly, judged to be a personal record for a man who ordinarily required half an hour merely to select a coat. The coach had not yet reached the 2nd milestone when he caught it, and Clemency Vane, looking out the window at the sound of a horse driven considerably harder than propriety allowed, found the Duke of Rivenoak arriving beside the coach door with his hair in open rebellion against every rule it had ever obeyed, breathing as though he had personally outrun the horse rather than merely ridden it. "You gave notice," he said to my housekeeper. "In writing." "It seemed the correct form, Your Grace. It was appalling form. You should have given it to me. You were not available to be given notice to. You were, I am told, avoiding the dining room." "I was not avoiding the dining room. I was avoiding the chair." He said this with the particular helplessness of a man who has run out of composure faster than he expected to, and has not yet decided what to do about it. "The chair on my right has been empty for 5 days, and I find I cannot construct a single sentence about anything else. I have signed correspondence to my own solicitor, addressing him as Miss Vane. Twice, somewhere behind Clemency's careful composure, something threatened to become a laugh, and she held it, barely, the way she had learned to hold most things that arrived before they were wanted. That seems a poor basis for a proposal, Your Grace." "It is not the basis." "Let me—" He stopped. Started again. She had never, in 3 months, watched him lose the thread of a sentence, and she watched it now with something close to wonder. Because his eloquence, she was coming to understand, failed him precisely at the moments that mattered most, and the failure was, itself, the truest thing he had ever said to her. "Because you moved a chair on your 11th day at Rivenoak, and never once explained why. Because you read Chancery Hand and settled a hedge dispute my own steward had failed at for a year. Because you told my aunt the truth about my ear before you told her anything flattering about yourself, when the lie would have cost you nothing and the truth cost you your position. Because Diogenes sits on your feet, which he has never once done for anyone, including, I am given to understand, the bishop. Because I have not had to ask a single person to repeat themselves at my own table in 3 months, and I did not notice how much that had cost me for 6 years, until you simply stopped it costing anything at all. He exhaled, and something in his shoulders that had been held at a precise, correct, dukely angle for the entirety of the conversation, and arguably for the entirety of 6 years, came loose. I am doing this badly. I had a speech. I rather think, Clemency said. And now the laugh she had been holding arrived, involuntary, unperformed, exactly the kind that had gotten her into trouble in 4 previous situations, and had, in this one, apparently undone a duke, that you are doing it exactly right, and that the speech would only have gotten in the way. Is that a yes? It is an obviously, Your Grace. It has been an obviously for some weeks. You were simply the last person at Rivenoak to be informed of it. And there, on the second milestone of the Rivenoak Road, with a coachman studiously examining the horizon, and a horse cropping grass with theatrical indifference, the Duke of Rivenoak laughed, not the correct, scheduled, coach arrives on time smile that had served him at weddings and tenants' gatherings for 6 years, but the real thing, the kind that catches a man by the ribs before his dignity can stop it, the kind nobody at Rivenoak had heard in 6 years, and had privately in their more honest moments wondered if they ever would again. It lasted, by Clemency's own later and entirely unbiased count, upward of 8 seconds, which does not sound like a great deal until one has waited 6 years to hear it. "Well," said the Duke, when he had recovered himself, which took some further moments, "I suppose you had better come back to the house. There is a chair going empty, and I am told the household finds it unbearable to look at." "The roses come with me," Clemency said, climbing down from the coach, with the coachman's assistance, and absolutely none of the Duke's, on principle. "That is non-negotiable. My mother's cottage garden. I'll not leave her roses to some tenant with no appreciation for them. I have already renewed the lease on your mother's cottage for 30 years, so I imagine the roses were never in any danger." Clemency stopped walking. "You did what?" "It was not meant to be discovered. I shall have words with my solicitor." He offered his arm, on her left, which put him at her right, which she noted with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching a habit become permanent without either party having had to discuss it. "Come home, Miss Vane. I find the chair suits you considerably better than the coach." The wedding took place in October, in the chapel at Rivenoak. With a congregation that included the entire household, half the tenant families whose hedges and leases the future Duchess had at some point personally adjudicated, and one elderly spaniel who had not been invited, had not been dissuaded, and who walked the length of the aisle a full 3 steps ahead of the bride, with an air of a dog personally responsible for the entire proceedings, which, in his own estimation, he rather was. Lady Ferris wept, briskly exactly once, at the vows, and pretended for the remainder of the ceremony that she had not. Simmons's left eyelid, by Mrs. Fenwick's private and closely guarded account, twitched no fewer than 7 times, a household record. Mrs. Fenwick herself said nothing at all, and simply stood very straight with her hands folded, which everyone who knew her understood to be the housekeeping equivalent of open weeping. The vows themselves were brief, correctly worded, and delivered, the groom having quietly and without discussion arranged it beforehand with the vicar, with the bride standing to his right. 2 words, the Duke murmured to her afterward, over the noise of a wedding breakfast that had gotten considerably louder and considerably less formal than any gathering Rivenoak had hosted in living memory. "I do. Rather less speech than the milestone required." "I found the milestone version more convincing," Clemency said. "It had the virtue of being true and badly delivered, which in my experience are the only speeches worth trusting." By the following spring, the negative spaces of Rivenoak had begun, one by one, to fill back in. The music room was opened in March, aired, dusted, the sheet lifted from the pianoforte with a ceremony that involved no ceremony at all, simply the Duchess of Rivenoak sitting down one wet afternoon, and picking out, badly and with great cheer, a tune her own mother had once taught her, while her husband stood in the doorway he had not crossed in 6 years, and, after a moment, crossed it. The tuner, paid quarterly out of habit for 6 years, and never once summoned, was finally given honest work. By June, the room was used often enough that nobody below stairs thought to remark on it any more, which was, in the considered opinion of Mrs. Fenwick, the surest sign a wound had properly closed. The chair at the Duke's right hand at every table in the house became, without a single word of instruction ever being issued, simply where his wife sat, and where, in time, guests learned to sit if they wished to be easily heard, and where new footmen were quietly informed by Simmons on their first day. That correspondence and trays and conversation alike went to the right, please, and no one troubled to explain further, because by then it required no explaining. The household had adopted, without ceremony, its own small permanent grammar, and visitors who noticed it at all noticed only that the Duke of Rivenoak seemed, these days, to hear everything said to him rather remarkably well. Lady Ferris took up permanent and self-appointed residence as the estate's unofficial minister of gossip and blessing, pronounced herself vindicated in all matters, and told the story of the drawing-room interrogation to every visitor who would sit still for it, embellishing it slightly more each telling until, by autumn, she had personally engineered the entire courtship from its very first chair. Nobody corrected her. Aldous Crane was heard of once more, briefly, in a letter from a solicitor in a distant county regarding an unrelated and unsuccessful venture, and was thereafter heard of not at all, which suited everyone, including, presumably, Mr. Crane, Diogenes, elevated by the household to a rank somewhere between pet and minor deity, took to sleeping across the threshold of the music-room of an evening, as though standing a private and satisfied guard over a door he had personally, in his own estimation, been instrumental in reopening. As for the smile, the real one, the unscheduled one, it arrived, by the following summer, most mornings, and had begun, on at least 2 recorded occasions that Mrs. Fenwick noted with the solemnity of a woman logging a rare astronomical event, to occur before breakfast, entirely without provocation, which the household agreed among themselves was the surest evidence yet that a 6-year winter had, at long last, and by the smallest and least dramatic of means, given way to spring. There are courtships that begin with grand declarations across crowded ballrooms, with rescued carriages and dramatic confessions delivered in the rain to the swell of some invisible orchestra. This was not one of those. This one began with a chair that wobbled, and a girl who laughed instead of apologizing, and a small quiet act of attention repeated so many mornings running that nobody, including the man it was performed for, noticed it had become the truest sentence spoken in that house in 6 years. Love, it turns out, rarely announces itself with any ceremony at all. More often it simply moves a chair to the correct side of the table, sits down, and waits, without complaint, to be noticed.